TorahCafe.com.
I'm going to begin with an assumption that everybody here does mitzvahs. Would that be right? Yep. Good. That's reassuring. Whether it's charity, whether it's tefillin, whether it's Shabbos candles, or everybody does something. But here's a question. Can anyone here please tell me why you do mitzvahs? Just one or two volunteers. Why do you do mitzvahs? What motivates you to do them? What do you hope to achieve in doing them? I suggest to you, as has just been demonstrated, that without Chasidus, nobody really appreciates what they're doing and why they're doing it, whatever that may be, whether it is the fulfillment of mitzvahs, which we do on a daily basis, whether it is prayer, whether it is Torah learning, and so on and so forth. Yes, so you can give me a view as you will have just done and tell me that we do these things just because, or we do these things because that's what God wants me to do. And you know what? You would be right. To be sure, that was the party line. That was the kind of acceptable norm. That's why people did mitzvahs. That's why people might still do mitzvahs. There is only one problem, and that is simply this. We do, over the generations, tend to become spiritually weakened, if you will, and that in turn runs all sorts of risks. We may not be as inclined to do things just because we're told that that's what God wants us to do. By way of analogy, as a child, when your mother or father told you to do something, you did it on account of 4 simple words. Anyone know what they are? Because I said so, right? But when you got that little bit older and felt that you suddenly had an opinion of your own, well, those same 4 words didn't always work as well. So, in a very similar context, maybe there are those who are spiritually inclined or emotionally inclined to do things because God says so. But at the core, it still begs the question, and what happens if somebody starts to lose a little bit of that appeal or develops a little bit of an opinion of their own? I mean, if you think of Sinai as the central magnet, the more that we pull away from the magnet, the more distant we become from the magnet, then it's an inevitable fact that as you progress through the ages, the less the magnet draws you in. The less inclined you will be to do things just because somebody said so. The great Baal Shem Tov would go out into a forest every year, just before Rosh Hashanah, and he would perform this rather spiritual, mystical ritual. He would light a fire, and he would sing special songs, and he would achieve whatever it was that he was looking to achieve for the coming year. His successor, the Maggid of Mizrich, came along and said, I don't know how to light the fire in the same way that the Baal Shem Tov did, but I can still sing the songs. His successor, Rabbi Moshe Leib Sossever, one of his successors, said, I don't know how to light the fire, and I don't even know how to sing the songs, but I can still come to the forest. I know where the forest is. And his successor, Rabbi Yisrael of Ruzhin, once commented, I don't even know where the forest is, but at least I can tell the story, and that should be enough. Meaning, even when you cannot light the fire, and even when you cannot sing the songs, or even if you don't even know where to go, at least you can tell the story. But what happens to someone who doesn't even know or remember the story? Does it all end with that particular individual? Do the fire and the song and the place all become forgotten, cast into the annals of history? That was the reality of the risk as it presented itself. The risk in Judaism really, totally burning out, literally. So along came the Baal Shem Tov in the early to mid 1700s, and he introduced the Jewish world to Chasidism. Of course, the term Chasid implies righteousness, piety, just simply engaging in deeper religious experiences, boldly going where no man had gone before. So by way, again, of example, the Torah commands us to pray. The Chasid would not simply pray, but he would spend hours in deep, meditative, contemplative thinking and prayer. And therefore, if prayer, for example, was going to run the risk of losing its appeal, I mean, my goodness, same book, same words, same time, 3 times daily, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, it's going to become boring. And some might have been inclined to stop praying. Or if not stop praying, certainly just rushing quickly through the process as a religious, burdensome chore of sorts, which essentially then defeats the whole purpose of what prayer is all about. So the Baal Shem Tov introduces the mystical dimension of Judaism, enabling the Jew to now think a little bit deeper about godliness, to meditate on the mystical connotations within the wording of the particular prayer and so forth. And all of a sudden it takes on a whole new meaning. It becomes an altogether different experience. Every word, every letter takes on life. It jumps out at you. You're thinking about something that you never thought about before. And you're feeling more connected to God through the process of that prayer. To be sure, the Baal Shem Tov didn't introduce something new. He simply revealed what was already there, albeit it wasn't something available to the masses. There's an author, a famous author called Jerome Mintz, who wrote a book called Legends of the Hasidim, which includes some aspects from another book known as Shivchei Habesht, which tells stories, anecdotes, etc. of the Baal Shem Tov. And one of the many details recounted over there is how the Baal Shem Tov would sometimes have this incredible transcendental sort of experience where his soul would leave his body and ascend heavenward, and he would have all these different kinds of experiences. And it wasn't such an instance where then when he woke up, he got his mission statement. He was charged with his task of now taking Hasidism to the world. I know somebody who works in a sushi restaurant, and he did so for many years, and he categorically refuses to eat the stuff. And I once asked him why. He explained actually quite cleverly and quite simply, any food that cannot be eaten of its own, but requires something else in order to make it edible, is not worth it. I think basically what he was saying was, you can have your rice, and you can have your fish, and you can have whatever else, your avocado and your sesame and your mango or whatever, all rolled up into the seaweed, but you still won't eat it unless you're going to have the soy sauce and the wasabi and some ginger. That was essentially the problem. The Baal Shem Tov foresaw, or if you like, it was intuit, that people were simply going to stop appreciating Judaism. And thus he came along to add the spice and the flavoring to teach the esoteric dimension of Judaism. Again, he didn't necessarily teach the very texts themselves. At the earliest point, that was only accessible to the spiritual giants. But he certainly took the concepts and he made them accessible to the masses, sometimes just simply by way of story, by way of anecdote. And movements emerged from this, picked up on this, and continue to perpetuate this till present day. That is Chasidism. Now, as you can appreciate, that certainly gave way to a lot of opposition, mostly from mainstream Jewry or Lithuanian Jewry or official Judaism, as historians dubbed it. There were those who argued, hey, you know what, we have enough of our own that we have to deal with over here. We have basic halacha and so on and so forth that I have to deal with in the general context of my overall religious observance and study. Don't start bringing in something new. I'm still struggling to familiarize myself with the basics. Standard halacha, Mishnah, Talmud, or whatever. You do what you have to do. Yes, of course, you pray 3 times a day, certainly with proper intent. But don't spend unnecessary or don't waste time unnecessarily in prayer when that's going to take away from your Torah learning. Moreover, they argued it's something that we have survived thousands of years without. So if I didn't need it then, I don't need it now either. And there are many of those who will argue that same point today as well. What is it they say? How many Jews does it take to change a light bulb? Change? God forbid. The flaw in the argument is simple and twofold. First, Chasidism is not separate from halacha, from Jewish law. It's part and parcel of halacha. It is, in the words of Rav Moshe Cordovero, a renowned mystic, to observe the mystical dimension without the practical halacha is like walking, looking up at the stars and ignoring the holes beneath your feet. But, the argument goes, inasmuch as you cannot have Chasidus or Hasidism without basic Jewish law and all the intricacies of general Jewish observance, you cannot have a life of general Jewish observance without Hasidism either. You can, but it'll be somewhat problematic. The world around us today readily attests to how many have lost their spirit of Judaism, just stuck in the letter of the law. You can be punctilious in your observance, but without the spirit, the letter dries out. So it's not as if people are going to start getting all mystical at the expense of Torah and of halacha. It's not as if people are going to suddenly stop learning Mishnah and Talmud and just bask entirely in the more spiritual and sublime dimension of Judaism. Sure, maybe the Lithuanian Jew would spend every waking minute learning Talmud, and the Hasidic Jew might take out a little bit of that time to allocate toward Hasidic study. But the two are not mutually exclusive. And the Hasidic Jew will argue that his Talmudic learning, just like his prayer and his overall observance, takes on an altogether different meaning on account of his added mystical Hasidic appreciation and dimension. Of course, the other flaw in the argument is like, well, any other facet of our existence. We don't rest on our laurels and advancements of our ancestors. With technology and with medicine, with each passing generation, we look to advance, we seek to, and we further explore to discover more, and that's the way it is in Hasidism as well. The famous analogy of the musician who's playing the violin, and people are drawn by the music. They're enraptured, they edge ever closer, and soon they're completely caught up in it such that they start dancing to the melody with so much fervor. And then a deaf man walks into the room and he sees a bunch of people jumping about with one man standing up at the front gesticulating with some instrument in his hand, and he thinks that they are all totally mad. Only, of course, they're not mad, are they? He is sadly deaf to the reality of the music. Hasidism is the music of the soul. To oppose it is to be deaf to its inherent melody and the notes it can play in our lives. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev was a great 18th century spiritual giant. And sometime soon after he got married, as was quite commonplace in those days, he said that he was going to go off and study by the Maggid of Mizrich. And this, of course, was opposed by his father-in-law, who was somewhat of an opponent of Hasidism. He said, where do you have to go there for? And he wanted to go away for a year. They compromised on 6 months. He was gone. He came back, and after that period of time, so his father-in-law looks to him and asks somewhat mockingly, "Nu, so what did you learn?" He says, "Well, I now know that God exists." He says, "Gewalt, you went away all that time, you left your new wife just to come back and tell me that?" He calls over the maid, "Gronya!" She comes over and he says, "Gronya, tell me, you like vodka?" She says, "I love vodka." And where does vodka come from? It comes from grain. Where does grain come from? It comes from the ground. And where does the ground come from? And she says, where does the ground come from? It comes from God. He says, "You see, she also says that God exists. And you had to go away for 6 months?" And he says, No. He looked to his father and says, "You don't understand. She says God exists. I now know that God exists." You see, as Jews, in our world today, we might talk God. We might even preach God. We pray to God. But what on earth is God beyond our superficial understanding? Hasidism teaches you how to be in a relationship with God. It gives you a glimpse into the divine beyond just the lip service. It enables you to know to whatever limited extent that we individually can. As human beings, we are comprised of body and soul. The body cannot exist without the soul, just as the soul remains wholly ineffective without the body. The two are interdependent and need to coexist. Both the candle and the wick need each other if they're going to be able to produce the necessary flame and light up its surrounds. And therefore, in the same vein, we have the exoteric dimension of Judaism, Yes, the rituals and the rigmaroles that we go through. And then there is the Chasidism, which gives us access into the esoteric dimension of Judaism, the deeper why and what for, which educates us in how to lead a more fulfilling life as a Jew. So now let's illustrate, coming back to the opening question about the fulfillment of a mitzvah. A mitzvah is the ultimate expression of how Judaism views religion. The word we typically translate, right, to mean commandment. But it also comes from the root word tzavta, which means to connect. As with any relationship, when you forego your own will for the sake of another, well, that's integral to the relationship, to establishing a bond. And so it is as well in regards to our relationship. Through observing divine commandments, I'm not doing what I want to do, but I'm doing what God wants me to do, then I'm establishing a connection with God. Moreover, the mitzvot govern every dimension of our lives, which means effectively that it enables us to bring God into every part of the human experience. So I eat a kosher breakfast in the morning, and I go for a quick prayer before sleep. And in that sense, mitzvahs provide me an opportunity to maintain an ongoing connection and relationship with God beyond the confines of just a synagogue and not limited to just the awe-inspiring high holidays. But that's as far as you're going to get in the exoteric dimension. And for some, it works. For many, it doesn't. So Hasidism comes along and ponders this relationship with God. Sounds great, poetic license, soundbite. But what on earth are we really talking about? What does it mean to be in a relationship with God? Indeed, how can I, a mortal being confined to the limitations of time and space, be in a relationship with an immortal being, somebody who's not subject to any confines whatsoever? So Hasidism comes along and explains the following. The whole point and purpose of why you are here in this world in the first instance was because God desired to have a dwelling place here on earth. But in order for him to be able to feel at home in a material world, there needs to be a process of transformation from the material to the spiritual. That is to say, as Hasidism puts it, God created the world by turning the spiritual into material, into physical. Our objective is to engage with the physical and elevate it back into something spiritual. How do we do that? Through the fulfillment of mitzvahs. You know, Marvin and Sadie, they were well into their 80s and they were in robust health. And the latter part of their lives was elongated in particular on account of Sadie's conscientious cooking, making sure that they were always only ever eating healthy. But even that couldn't save them when they were celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary on a ship, which sadly sunk. And they suddenly find themselves standing before this great palatial home up in heaven. And Marvin is looking, saying, "What is this place?" And a voice comes out and says, "This is your reward for all the good you did on earth." He says, "Great, well, what's going to cost me a fortune? How am I going to pay the mortgage in this place?" And the voice said, "It's not going to cost you anything. It's reward for all the good that you did. Please feel free to go inside." So he goes inside and he takes in the scene. Maids, servants, all the extra. And he goes, so that's the catch. The upkeep is going to cost me a fortune. And the voice says, no, it's your reward for all the good you did in this earth. So he starts to climb up the spiral stairway and he looks out the window and he sees this most magnificent golf course. And again he thinks, so that's what's going to cost me, playing over there. And again the voice says, no, you can tee off there anytime you want, 24/7, well, except for Shabbos. You can go and play as often as you want on that golf course. And later he and his wife are going for a walk outside and they come to the clubhouse and they walk inside and they see the most magnificent foods and all the delicacies. And he says, that's the catch. It's going to cost me a fortune to eat. And the voice again says, no, it's all yours. Reward for all the good that you did. You can eat and indulge as much as you want. And he says, what? I don't have to worry about my blood sugar levels. I don't have to worry about my cholesterol. I don't have to worry about all the fat in the food. I said, no, it's all yours. Nothing to worry about. Just enjoy for all of eternity. At which point Marvin is glancing with rage in his eyes across the room towards his wife, Sadie. And she looks at him and she says, what? What is it? He says, If it wasn't for you and your stupid bran muffins, we could have been up here 10 years ago. And the moral of the story is simple. Our objective in life is not to escape into heaven. Our purpose is to bring heaven down to earth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely what Chasidus does. It enables even the common man, that's you and I, to achieve the very objective of that for which God created the world in the first instance. And that is to make it a place in order for him to be able to feel at home. In order for God to feel the proliferation of spirituality throughout, to ensure that there is spiritual serenity permeating every facet of our existence. But how is that achieved? Indeed, how does the fulfillment of a mitzvah enable us to elevate the material? And here again, Hasidism comes along and tells you how you can be that little bit more divine. You know, our sages taught us that Torah was created by God even before he brought the world into being. In fact, it served as the blueprint for the world. And thus, because it already existed, our forefathers, through their own prophetic ability, were able to know the content of the Torah prior to its having been given. And they were able to keep any number of mitzvot prior to it having been given. Which then begs the question, so what was the uniqueness of Sinai? What was the point of the great national event of God giving the Torah to the Jewish nation at Sinai? Why couldn't it just be passed down already from the forefathers to their descendants? And the answer is this, as Chasidus explains. Before the actual giving of the Torah at Sinai, there was this great divide. To cite the words in Psalms, the heavens were the heavens of the Lord, and the earth he gave to man. And there was this upper spiritual realm, and then there was this lowlier terrestrial realm, and never the twain shall meet. And then came the giving of the Torah, where God nullified, if you will, that earlier decree and said, the lower realms shall rise to the higher realms, and the higher realms shall lower themselves to the lower realms. And there was this great infusion, there was this great fusion between heaven and earth that took place at the giving of the Torah. The gap was filled. And now all of a sudden, you had the opportunity, if we can bring heaven down to earth, it was through the power of the mitzvah, as contained within the Torah, that we have that very real ability to achieve this objective. In practical terms, by virtue of God commanding us to put on tefillin, these black boxes and leather straps suddenly become holy. Suddenly, they have unique spiritual energy and powers. Because God said to shake the lulav, then this simple palm branch suddenly becomes imbued with sacredness. That was the uniqueness of Sinai. That is the power of a mitzvah. Prior to that, Abraham, he could have taken the black boxes and he could have put them on exactly as the Torah prescribed. But because it wasn't a mitzvah, because it had not been formally commanded, just something he was aware of through his own prophetic ability, it would not have achieved anything. It would have been a meaningless gesture. The boxes would have been little more than black painted pieces of animal hide. Only after the Torah is formally given and everything is commanded by God do the actions that we do assume a sanctity, and the material objects which we exploit for those actions then become sanctified. The material becomes transformed into the spiritual. And just to prove the point, Chasidus makes a simple observation. If Abraham really kept all of the Torah prior to his having been given, which means he also kept all the practical commandments, then why didn't he circumcise himself until God told him to do so at the age of 99? You knew it already beforehand, so just do it. And again, the answer is one and the same. It would have been nothing more than a meaningless gesture and a blemish on his skin, until such point as God had to command him to do so. And when God commands him, then it becomes a mitzvah. It's a commandment and a connection, whereby now when he's fulfilling, he's elevating himself and his body in the process. So here I am, a 21st century Jew. I find Jewish life boring. It's archaic. Why do I need to do this? What is the significance? Just because God says so? Comes along Chasidism and focuses my mind on the real value of every mitzvah, teaching me how every deed is of great cosmic significance, serving as a bridge between creator and creation. So when the question is asked, and Rabbi Tzalushkin mentioned this last night, somebody will turn around and say, I don't keep Shabbos. I don't keep kosher. You should have seen where I just came from, and you have no idea where I'm about to go. So what's the point of stopping me on the street right here and now and asking me to put on tefillin? And yet when we consider what I just said, how each deed achieves such great objective, then every single mitzvah is taken independently as something unique and extraordinary and is of infinite value in and of itself. The value of every single mitzvah doesn't become diminished, even if a person is otherwise not committed to any kind of observant lifestyle. So that's all just by way of introduction. Now let's consider the reality, modern era. We talk about, let's play a game of word association. With word association, it is believed that it can reveal some of your subconscious thinking. It shows the things that you typically associate with the word that I put out there. So in order for me to better understand your perception of Hasidism or certain Hasidim, I'm going to throw out a couple of words at you, and I want you to throw out at me maybe the first word that comes to your mind. So let's start. Just yell it out. Chasid. Kindness. Okay. Satmar.
Hasid.
No, you can't do that. I said that already. Sorry? Something. Come on, quick. You're thinking. You're not allowed to think. Severe. Okay. Chabad. Loving. Okay. Kapota. Sorry? Rabbi. Okay. Breslov. Dance. Black hat. Serious. Natori Karta. That's okay. Say it again, please. Okay, that works. Hasidic woman. Beautiful. Okay. It is true, and it has to be said, that there may well be certain sects that live in their own enclave that might regard women as inferior, that limit the scope of the Hasidic woman's learning, that consider the secular Jew to be second class, and essentially they remain completely detached emotionally and psychologically from the world they navigate. To be sure, and this must be stressed, it's never for me to judge, but when you do see that attitude out there, I suggest to you that by no means are they representative of the Chasidism as a whole, or in conformity with what the Baal Shem Tov initially intended when he introduced Chasidism to the world. But still, such attitudes do inevitably make some of these sects a source of strife because of the apparent extremist attitudes, propagandistic energy, and intolerance. Here's a fascinating piece of historical information. Where does radical Judaism come from? Most people will not be aware of this, but there was a psak din, a Jewish court ruling in Michalovce, Hungary in 1864, where a broad range of laws were suddenly passed. There were elements within the Jewish Orthodox community that came together, and they said things like, from here on in, one is forbidden to enter any synagogue where the sermon is going to be in German or other foreign language instead of traditional Yiddish. Even if that means that you're otherwise going to have to pray and you have nowhere else to pray and you're going to have to pray at home. Better you pray at home than you go into such a synagogue. Another one was something along the lines of a chuppah must, under all circumstances, take place in the open sky outdoors, and any other chuppah is invalid. This and more is precisely that which gave way to what might be described, and I say this unabashedly, radical orthodoxy. In simple terms, if you want to know today where B'nai Brak or Mea Sha'arim come from, you could most likely trace its roots back to 1864. And yes, in the process, they dragged numerous Hasidic movements along with them, with that mindset, with that psyche. And that gave way to even radicalism within a lot of the mainstream Hasidic sects. And I will reiterate again, that is by no means representative of what the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chasidism, ever intended. That's not what Chasidism is all about. He himself, on the one hand, of course, was a great mystic, which might imply exclusivity. In other words, mysticism was traditionally a closed group available only to the great mystics. On the other hand, he was a Baal Shem, which implies a healer, someone looking to bring healing to the masses. So what the Baal Shem Tov represents, therefore, was bringing healing to the masses through the mystical dimension. That's what he intended Hasidism to be. The fact that certain sects don't reflect that should not be interpreted to mean that Hasidism is not relevant in the 21st century. It's more a reflection on some who may have lost focus of what it was always intended to be. So let's consider, what is the genuine Hasidic attitude to the Jewish woman? Now here's a little eye-opener for you. In mainstream Judaism, which otherwise was previously known as Lithuanian Jewry, there always existed the concept of the lumdim. Lumdim, by definition, refers to the many who would go away for great lengths of time, months, even maybe years, to sit away from their families, to sit and study, whilst the wife remained at home providing for her children. The Gaon of Vilna praises his sons as heroes for going away for great lengths of time. And the end result, of course, is that the woman had little or no opportunity to study. All historians agree with this fact. Some even go so far as to suggest that it therefore also impacted negatively on their young children as well, because if you don't have it within you, how can you pass it on to the next generation? Did that concept exist amongst Hasidism as well? That's already a matter of debate. Some historians insist that not, others say yes, certainly so, and we do see an illustration of that in that story I told you before of Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev. But one thing is for certain, they did have more access to the tracts, they had more access to the Hasidic leader, so there was more access, if you like, to the overall spirituality. But here's a newsflash for you. It was Hasidism which opened the doors for the traditional Jewish woman to be able to be properly educated. Sarah Schneer was a woman of Hasidic descent. And in her own way, not too dissimilar to the Baal Shem Tov, she saw the pending risks of her own. If we don't educate women, then they're going to seek out their education elsewhere, in mainstream schools, and then we would risk them falling out of the fold altogether. So what did she do? She founded what was then the only ever, and now the world famous, Beis Yaakov movement, an all-girls school. Could you imagine the intense opposition that she will have encountered? You're educating women in mainstream schools, giving them mainstream Jewish education. But it was the Gerer sect, the Hasidic movement originating from Poland, that took up her cause, that promoted it to what became a movement with over 300 schools around the world. The only other noted exception was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who also opened girls' schools and arguably went one revolutionary step further in Russia, because he made the Hasidic teachings also accessible to the girls as well. And even more so in the mainstream Lithuanian Jewish world, it was unheard of to lecture to women. Rabbis, Rosh Yeshiva, etc., they would lecture to all male audiences. If the husband wants to go home and make that his table talk, that's his business. The one noted exception was the Chafetz Chaim, who delivered a discourse to an all-female audience in the mid-1920s. But apart from that, again, it was the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Chasidism, who revolutionized that as well. Today it's commonplace. Today you have women's education. Today you have women's lectures. Today women have equal access into the mainstream of Jewish learning. It has become the acceptable norm throughout Orthodoxy as a whole, but it's worthwhile remembering where it in fact originated from. In fact, some of the modern methodology that we have today when it comes to education originates from Chasidism. Rabbi Clonimus Kalman Shapiro, again, more than, whatever it was, over 100 years ago, wrote a text, again, a Hasidic rabbi, where he discusses against corporal punishment and the negative effects of taking too strong a disciplinary approach towards children who might portray negative habits. And like Hasidism in general, which is so focused on nurturing the negative and turning it into something positive, he writes in great detail about how you can take every negative trait in a child and nurture it in some sort of positive way. 21st century is now in mainstream schools catching up with that idea. He says you can take stubbornness, which might be, in the first instance, a negative attribute. But don't stifle the child. Don't squelch the negative. Somehow turn that stubbornness in some kind of positive direction. Let this stubbornness be for pursuit of the things that the child should be doing. I want to just take 3 minutes, maybe 4, to elaborate that little bit more about how Hasidism sees the role of the Jewish woman today. Let's be clear. For generations, women were chattel and discriminated against throughout all of civilization. Today, there's equal access to education, to employment, professional opportunities. There's equal pay in the workplace, equal standing on numerous levels all over society. But that doesn't change our reality. We are built physically different. Our brains are wired differently. Our emotive responses react differently. And the hard fact is, as Hasidism points out, our souls are fundamentally different as well. Male and female, he created them, says the verse. The psychological and the emotional differences between men and women do not need to impact on their roles within wider society. As a woman, you might be inclined to cry quicker when watching some sad romantic movie. But that shouldn't affect your ability to be a CEO of, Lucent Technologies like Carly Fiorina or any other kind of role that you would have in the outside world. So your emotional differences to that of men doesn't have to impact your reality and your functioning in mainstream society. But the spiritual variation, the differences in soul, does mean that there has to be variation in the nurturing process of that soul. Because when we talk about religious expression, we're not talking about ability or capability. We're talking about your spiritual DNA and how you best develop that. And then Hasidism comes along and tells you that on that basis, therefore, there is that fundamental difference in approach. And therefore, when you ask the question, what is the role of the Jewish woman in the 21st century? What we're really asking is, can a modern woman find a place in traditional Judaism? And in order to answer that question, I think we have to recognize at the outset that the values of secular society with which we identify modernity are very much at odds with the values that traditional Judaism has. And I think we need to ask ourselves, which world are we going to be living in? Are we going to be modern Jews or Jews who happen to be modern? That's the Hasidic approach. The world has conditioned us to see what is more visible and to appreciate that as being more important. The concept of feminism is forgetting the very real differences and the very real goals, just assuming that what men are doing is more important because it's more visible, more overt. And if we can do it too, without taking into account the distinctions. And Hasidism goes out of its way to overemphasize the fact that it's not just in the realm of working, it's in the realm of being. That is to say that we have a mission in life as human beings. And every single one of us individually has something unique to give to this world. Just as no two faces are the same and no two thinking processes are the same, so too no two souls are the same. And in terms of categories, men and women are distinct categories. They give different things to the world. Nowhere is that more evident in Jewish life and living. For some, Judaism is defined by coming to shul. And when you are in shul during the holidays or other such occasions, you'll ask who's the most important person. Well, you're going to say that's the rabbi. Why? Because that's what's most overt. The synagogue is out there. The rabbi is sitting up on top. When society dictates that your sense of importance and validity is based on visibility, well, Judaism comes along and says, no. What's most important is what is most sacred to the core of your individual soul. When you ask an observant Jew, what is the most important part of their Judaism? The answers will always be Shabbos, kosher, and family purity. Those are the things that are done in the privacy of our own home. We don't know whether someone really is or isn't turning off his television on the Shabbos, catching the ball game on a Friday night. We don't know what is or isn't going on in someone else's kitchen, and we certainly don't know what's going on in someone else's bedroom. They're all private practices. But it's precisely this which defines their Judaism. For such people, Judaism is not about synagogue. It's first and foremost about the home. Judaism is built in the home. What is more visible, says Chasidus, is not necessarily more powerful. And the Torah teaches us, as Chasidus points out, right from the outset, when the angels ask Abraham, so where is your wife Sarah? And he answers, well, she's in the tent. Well, in other words, she was less visible. But in some ways, she was even more powerful than Abraham, as God himself attests to when he tells Abraham, whatever Sarah tells you, listen to what she has to say. You know, my grandmother of blessed memory was a remarkable woman. And she once went into a private audience with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I don't know how many decades ago. And it was one of the first times that she had been. And the Rebbe, true to his style, challenged her about what she was doing for the benefit of her wider community then in Toronto, and charged her with the task of setting up the first Jewish women's organization, Neshei Chabad. It was to be the first of its kind in the world. Since then, of course, there are countless throughout the world. It served as the infrastructure for women's activism. Again, it's Hasidus that recognizes that reality. Mainstream Judaism always insisted that the role of the woman is just simply to, if you'll excuse the crudeness, be in the kitchen and the bedroom. And Hasidus came along, and as we see all the more so in the last century, and all the more so in this century, and says, no, the woman's role is as much to be out there as the man. She too should be equally educated. She too should share in all of the teachings. She too should set up networks and organizations and look to reach out and attract and appeal to other women as well. In fact, the Rebbe took it the most revolutionary step forward when he didn't just send out shluchim, male representatives to all parts of the world, but also shluchais, female emissaries, empowered to be the Saras of their community, operating side by side with their Abrahams. You see, Chasidism has a global vision that extends beyond the here and now. Chasidism, the way the Baal Shem Tov always intended, is committed to the ideal of redeeming this world and maintaining that the gradual change in the image of the Jewish woman is one of the hallmarks of redemption, in keeping with the words of the prophet, O Jeshama Barei Yehuda, that will yet be heard in the cities of Yehuda and the outskirts of Jerusalem, the voice of the groom and the voice of the bride. This then brings me briefly to another attitude of Hasidism, the approach to the, shall we say, westernized Jew, to use the term of historians, what you might otherwise describe as the more secular Jew. And again, sadly, the image, if you ask a person, Hasidism, secular Jew, you conjure up an image of throwing stones at people driving cars in the streets of Jerusalem on a Shabbos and so on and so forth. But let me ask you a question. Who was the first to introduce outreach in the world? It wasn't Lomdim, it wasn't official Judaism, it wasn't the yeshiva world, Lithuanian world. In fact, it wasn't anybody within mainstream Judaism. The attitude was always one of, you're either with us or not. So if you weren't up to scratch, you didn't find your place. And that in turn resulted in the growth of heterodox movements. There are only two ancient tracts, if you will, that speak of the necessity of engaging the westernized Jew. One is the Tanya, written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, and the other is a tract by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Both these texts were written more than 200 years ago, emphasizing the need to engage every Jew, recognizing the value of every Jew, helping to lead the Jew back to his roots. Again, It was something that was demonstrated by the Baal Shem Tov in the way that he himself engaged with and spent an extraordinary amount of time with the simple folk. In fact, one historian described quite intriguingly a difference in attitude between various sects. He used a very cute analogy. He said, in the Talmud it talks about the idea of a Chasid Schochet. That is to say, you're walking along and there's a woman drowning in the water. So you turn around and you say, I'm a religious Jew, I can't touch a woman. But I'm a Chasid. So you're a Chasid, but you're a Chasid Schochet, you're a fool. There's a woman drowning, you got to help her, you got to save her. So using that analogy in the context of a Jew drowning in the tides of assimilation, he wrote, and this is his words, not mine, the Satmar would allow him to drown. The Lubavitcher would jump right in to save him. And then he said, and the Kloisenberger would throw him a rope. I'm not, God forbid, looking to be disparaging of anyone. And I think it's fair to say that today many have come a longer way. But again, it reflects a certain variation of approach. The interesting thing that has evolved over time is that Lubavitch and Chabad were marginalized. Think about it for a moment. The Lithuanian world says, you're Hasidim. We don't want to have anything to do with you. There's overall opposition. The Hasidic world sees them as too liberal, going too far in their outreach approach. Breslau were always more accepted because although that was part of their modus operandi, they never necessarily engaged it in the way that they should necessarily have done. Only in the last several decades did they start doing that little bit more. And yet, look at the Jewish world today. How many other organizations have jumped on the bandwagon of reaching out and trying to bring Jews back? 30 years ago, everybody criticized Chabad for doing so. Today, well, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And I say to you, that's a good thing. The more Jews that are being reached out to, the better. But let's remember where it began. It started with Hasidism. We mentioned before about how everything here in this world is intended to serve a higher spiritual purpose. So again, we don't shun technology or any other modern innovation. Hasidism will say that if God enabled man to have the ingenuity with which to be able to invent a television, then the Lubavitcher Rebbe will have his Hasidic Farbrengens broadcast on television. Hasidism will say that if God enabled Mark Zuckerberg to have the ingenuity to introduce Facebook to the world, then we have to figure out how we can use that Facebook in order to reach out to as many Jews as possible, impact them, invite them to your classes, or bring a Torah thought out to them. Somebody once asked a question of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was the first to send out, if you will, shluchim, messengers, emissaries to different parts. And he said, aren't you taking a risk? I mean, after all, if you take a cup of hot water and you put it into a cold sea, you run the risk of the hot water completely cooling off. You send to take a Jew out of his Crown Heights or wherever it is, and you send him out to Cambodia, what's going to happen to him? So the Frierdiker Rebbe answered and said, by way of your analogy, you might be right. A cup of hot water will cool off in a cold sea. But if the hot water is coming from the mains, then it remains always hot because it's continuously flowing directly from the mains. If a person remains eminently attached to source, then they will never cool off. Everything comes straight from the pipe, and ultimately over time you may be starting to warm up a little bit of the sea. Which of course brings us to a final point, and that is this whole Rebbe-Chassid relationship. Because one key area of opposition was exactly that, this passionate and fervent attachment to the Hasidic leader. What constituted a leader? Someone with unique charisma, exceptional communication skills, whom others recognize as a unique and spiritual individual. Spiritual in the sense that they're able to communicate the infinite to the finite through their teachings, through their preachings, and what have you. And to be honest with you, it's very difficult to actually describe a Hasidic leader unless you ever encountered one, or to put it in the words of Eli Wiesel after the Rebbe's passing, it's difficult to describe in words because the more I met him, the more distanced I felt. But the flaw, again, the opposition to the Hasidic attachment to the leader, the flaw in that is that it was argued, well, we have God, and it's just wrong to revere anybody else to any great extent. But I suggest to you, when there is somebody so lofty, so spiritual, with clear, undeniable spiritual ability and insight, Why wouldn't I want to consult him on medical issues, on personal matters, etc.? The only thing is because it was more overt within Chabad, mostly because literally hundreds of thousands of people would flock to the Rebbe, it was more susceptible to criticism. Because the concept was so alien in mainstream Jewish world, they were the ones to criticize. And yet today, well, frankly, again, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. But can a Hasidic sect survive in a 21st century without a leader physically there at the helm? Well, according to anthropologists, one of the key determining factors of modernity is the ability to communicate. And on that basis, if the Hasidic master has communicated his ideals through his teachings and through his writings, etc., then we have what is necessary to carry on the task. And proof, if it was needed, is that demographers were predicting the demise of Chabad soon after the Rebbe's passing 20 years ago. And yet during these past 2 decades, it has grown. Chabad has grown exponentially from strength to strength. Why? Because the legacy of a true leader is eternal. Their life continues to inspire everlastingly. A leader, a Hasidic leader, is great not because of his power, but because of his ability to empower others. You know, great leaders are like the best conductors. They reach beyond the notes to touch the magic in the players. True leaders, they don't enforce, they inspire. That's what Hasidism always looked to do. Leaders lead, which implies a destination ahead, someplace that isn't right now, and they shine a light. And that's how they attract followers from one century into the next, enabling Jewish people to continue to grow and to flourish. So in summation, our world today is more fast-paced than ever before. And people are either struggling to keep up or otherwise are simply giving up. In the process, many may be losing sight of their objective, no longer appreciating their whole purpose for being or forgetting about meaning and purpose of life in general and Jewish life in particular. The philosopher Nietzsche famously said, "The world is beautiful but has a disease called man." Hasidism insists that the precise beauty of the world is made up of those who were made in the image of their Creator. And the only difference between those who look to build and those who seek destruction lies in their perception of the world. And the ability to see beauty in the world is the beginning of our moral sensibility, because what you believe is beautiful, you will not wantonly destroy. Chasidism says, the world we truly desire is good. It can be one. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It is yours. And with its teachings about life and its genuine attitudes toward women, education, other Jews, and the world as a whole, it focuses our minds on how to achieve that very real objective. There was an alumni of a renowned university who arrived on campus for a reunion. And he went to visit the economics department, and he had majored in that years prior. He notices, as the professor is distributing examination papers to the students, and he remarks, you know, these are the same questions that they asked 25 years ago. To which the lecturer replied, the questions may be the same as 25 years ago, but today the answers are altogether different. The truth is, in the Jewish worldview, questions change all the time. With each passing generation, new challenges emerge, new questions arise. But the answers, they remain the same, and have done ever since Hasidism was first introduced into the world. When you explore the Hasidic dimension, one comes to appreciate the beauty of life in every generation. And therefore, it is incumbent upon us to do what we can do to explore that much more. In that opening anecdote, we asked the question. The Baal Shem Tov used to light the fire and tell the story, and all the way through the different generations, there was somebody who was at least able to tell the story. What happens if you don't know the story? Is it all over? The answer is no. Hasidism empowers you to write your own story, to recreate the story, to make your own impact. It's a story that began once upon a time 5,774 years ago. Today you're challenged to add your own chapter. And when the Baal Shem Tov had one of those transcendental experiences, and he met with Mashiach himself, he asked him, when will you come at long last? And Mashiach replied, when you will spread your well springs outward. By definition, when you will encourage more to engage in Hasidic study, to find lasting purpose and true meaning in everything that they do in the kaleidoscope of Jewish experience, that's what will transform this world. That's what will bring Mashiach. If we all seek to explore more, then the chapter we write can be the epilogue of this book of exile. And we will then merit to step into a new world, which will be filled with the knowledge and the proliferation of Hasidic teaching, of mystical teaching of God, when we will all be Hasidim in every true sense. May we indeed merit this speedily.